Topa! What are you doing?
Papa.
You will come with me at once! Get out of my way, Kalon!
I'm afraid that will not be possible. I will not permit you to disrupt the procedure.
I forbid you to do this. You will destroy him!
That is inaccurate. He will be altered physically, but he will remain a fully functioning biological organism.
He will be a monstrosity!
That is also inaccurate. I surmise your capacity to reason has been compromised by your cultural indoctrination. This is to be expected. Please depart.
Welcome to Treknobabble Psychobabble, where art, music, politics, philosophy, and especially psychology meet far beyond the stars and where few have gone before. I'm Elliott, your resident Trek nerd for service and devotion.
And I'm Elizabeth, student of humanoid psychology, and you'd think that I deserve a fat promotion.
Our mission each week is to boldly tackle an idea or ideas through the lens of our beloved franchise to seek out and explore new perspectives about who we are and who we could be. This week, Elizabeth and I wrap up our discussion of trans allegories in Star Trek with a little diversion away from Star Trek. The Orville was created in 2017 by Seth MacFarlane, who most famously created the long-running animated sitcom Family Guy. Pitched as a kind of spoof of The Next Generation, the show leaned heavily into comedic elements at first, frequent anachronisms of Trek-like conventions, technologies, and social philosophy with recognizably MacFarlane contemporary social behavior, and frankly often sophomoric humor. It premiered before the current expansive roster of new Trek series began to air, actually just a couple weeks before Star Trek Discovery premiered. As such, many Trek fans are divided about their feelings on the Orville. Some feel that it is the true heir of classic Trek, lovingly recreating much of the atmosphere and moral philosophy that typified TNG, while others feel it represents a regressive backlash against the very sincere and unapologetic so-called woke politics that permeate Discovery, Picard, and to a lesser extent, the other current official Trek series. So why are we talking about it? It's a good question. Elizabeth, I don't know how you feel with the Orville, but I'm curious.
I really like the Orville, and I didn't think I would. I was actually hanging out with some mutual friends of ours, Elliott, and they also are big Star Trek fans, and they mentioned the Orville, and I was like, oh, I haven't watched that show. I don't want to. Why would I want to watch a show that's making fun of Star Trek, something I really love? And they were immediately like, oh no, it's so good. And I watched an episode with them. And the Orville does make fun of Star Trek. It definitely did it, especially in the beginning. But they make fun of it in a way, in the way that someone who loves Star Trek makes fun of Star Trek. You know, it's like, yeah. I'm going to point out all these like little incongruencies that don't make sense in this universe and then fix them in mine, which I thought was great. And I really, really like the Orville. I enjoy watching it. I don't, there's room for all of it in my book, you know?
I agree. And we'll talk about this today. Like, I understand why some fans, whichever camp they're in about the Orville, feel the way they do. To me, I think both shows are better for each other existing. You're not wrong. I mean, Seth MacFarlane's a big Star Trek fan. You can see that in his work. He references it all the time. And I think he and a lot of us were nostalgic for those kind of golden age days of Trek in the 90s. And that's the aesthetic, especially, and the sort of tone and vibe that the Orville goes for. But it has become a more sophisticated show as it's gone on.
Yeah.
And I think it deserves its place on TV. Today, we are going to explore the story of Topa, who stumbled her way into being the most effective trans allegory in any of the series we've talked about so far. We think the evolution of the topic on the Orville mirrors the evolution of the allegory on Trek spanning the decades, and it tracks the evolution of the show and of the society that birthed it. I'll repeat our disclaimer one more time. While we don't want to sidetrack our discussion of the salient topic, trans rights are human rights. Queer people aren't grooming your kids. And if any of that makes you uncomfortable to hear, you may want to skip this week's show.
Clyden.
The topic is introduced to the series in the 3rd episode of the 1st season, airing in 2017, written by Seth MacFarlane and directed by veteran Trek producer and writer Brandon Braga. About a Girl reveals that Lieutenant Commander Bortus and his mate Clyden have had a child. The child is female, which is considered a rare birth defect in Moclan society. At first, both parents opt for the standard corrective surgery to reassign the child to male. Dr. Finn, the Orville CMO, refuses to perform the surgery on an infant who can't consent, so Bortus arranges for a Moclan vessel to collect his family and have the procedure done by a Moclan doctor instead. This leads to a crisis of law and cultural tradition on the ship. Bortus' friends and colleagues attempt different methods of persuasion, and he is eventually convinced that, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, his daughter's unique attributes won't necessarily condemn her to an unfulfilled life. However, Clyden is adamant that their daughter undergo the procedure as, it turns out, Clyden himself was born female. With the parents split on the issue, when the Orville arrives on Moklis, there is a trial to determine the fate of their child. Exo Kelly Grayson does her best to represent Bortus and the female gender in general, but the crux of their argument rests with the discovery of a reclusive female Moclan living in the mountains called Havina. She turns out to be the true identity of a famous and revered Moclan poet whom their society universally admires. Despite this complication and demonstration of the potential for female Moclans, the ruling is issued that the child is to be reassigned. Bortus and Clyden return to the Orville with their son, whom they name Topa, and promise to love him and each other no matter what lies in their future.
Yeah, when Bortus puts the little stuffed animal of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in Topa's crib at the very end, I thought that was such a sweet moment, and just like how Seth MacFarlane references Star Trek in his other, works like Family Guy, I love the references like to the Muppets and to other just like big things of American culture that have seeped their way into the Orville. I think it's really sweet and really touching, and that was a really hopeful gesture to me when Bortus did that, when he offered like, here's your stuffed animal, and you don't know what this means yet, but I know what it means, and I love you. Like, oh, that was so sweet.
And promises of things to come. And I think in Star Trek proper, there are so many examples of terrible parents, right? That it's nice to see at least one person who may make some mistakes, but is pretty good. And actually, there's two, because Dr. Finn is another example of a really good parent on the show, and it's a good thing to see.
Yeah. Because
you've got Sarek, of course, Spock's father, and Worf, and I guess Beverly Crusher is an okay parent, but anyway, there's a lot of bad parents in Star Trek, so this is sort of refreshing. I'll say right off the bat that although, as we said in the beginning, the Orville in its story of Topa gets better as it goes and eventually becomes great, the starting point is pretty problematic and not an ideal representation of the topic that they're trying to talk about. This is 2017, so the issue hadn't quite blown up into the mainstream the way it has now in 2022, but it certainly is something that should have been handled with some more sensitivity than they did in this episode, I think.
I did like this episode, though I do admit that the Orville has gotten progressively better as the seasons have progressed, and I think that's true of a lot of shows. Like, I'm really, really loving the new season right now, but this is when they were first starting out. And the premise of this, it rests a lot on biology versus innate identity. So as them using it as a trans allegory, it's relying a lot on the idea that biology determines gender in a really interesting way, especially because they have presented the Moclans as this all-male species, but the males also are able to reproduce. And so there's already this dichotomy there about what's the difference between sex and gender. If everyone's male, but they're obviously still able to reproduce, then what makes a male male? So, like, there's that innate, there's that innate ambiguity.
Contradiction.
Yeah, contradiction and ambiguity already within this, what they're trying to portray is this really rigid culture and species. But then they're also talking about Topa's gender and sex as this very biologically determined thing. And especially if you're going to use this as a trans allegory, that's not accurate to understanding that issue. And so I think that's a little problematic, as much as they're trying.
Well, and I don't think they were going for a trans allegory with this episode. They realized later on that they had created a trans character, and they, I think, did something great with it. But at this point, it's more about a somewhat rudimentary, if ill-conceived conception of feminism, I think. So the Mocklins, this presenting all-male species, although not all-male, we learn quickly, what are their traits? They're like these toxic masculine, like, it's like Zardoz or something, right? They're all like, and they're always hitting things, and
we are industry, and we have destroyed our home planet, and we make weapons. It's very much a caricature of something that is part of human nature, and just like all these species, both in Star Trek and in Orville, they're just amplifications of something that does exist. It's just a caricature of it. So like there is that.
Right. Well, yeah, I agree. The allegory that they were trying to set up is by accentuating these typically, kind of toxically masculine attributes in this species, and then saying, well, what if you have women? What does that mean for you? Like, I think they were going more for, like, don't be a toxic dude, bro, which is a perfectly fine message. But in focusing on that and ignoring what they had done with this character who, or all these characters, right, implied that this happens every once in a while. We learn it actually happens kind of frequently, that they force these infants to undergo gender reassignment. It creates a whole different problem that they weren't, I don't think, intending when they wrote this. And to that point, I do think it's kind of clumsy. I mean, I appreciate a lot of what happens in this episode, but like Kelly's demonstration in the courtroom.
The tribunal will note that this female was more than strong enough to reshape the cube. Show me a male in this chamber who can do the same. Well, my point is made. While this male may be the fleet's best pilot, he's also an idiot.
It's just so sort of like on the nose and kind of childish in terms of making an argument about gender equality. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's almost as if the Mocklins think all males are like this and all females are like that. And here Kelly's presenting an example of like, look, I have one person to like counter your argument, therefore it's done. Like neither side is actually making a very good argument, to be fair.
Yes, which when you're doing a courtroom style drama, I mean, we talked about A Measure of a Man a few weeks ago, and that's a really good courtroom story. You have to have effective arguments on both sides. Otherwise, it's not convincing. It just feels like a straw man. And that's kind of what we were left with here, despite the sincerity of the message as it was constructed. And yeah, it's called bioessentialism, this particular kind of bigotry where you restrict your definition of gender to biology, right? To which genitals you have or were born with, rather, which chromosomes you have. Which, to be clear, we did not, as a species, know that chromosomes existed before we understood what gender was. That came way later. We knew what gender was as a species before we understood why sex presents the way it does or how reproduction works. Well before that, we understood innately, because of the way we present to each other, what gender is. So Claire makes an argument in refusing to perform the surgery, Dr. Finn, that she would probably perform a circumcision or a cleft palate correction on an infant, despite it not consenting to it, and sees the comparison between that and gender reassignment as absurd.
That's completely different.
How? It is a significant bodily alteration, and the infant has no say in the matter.
A circumcision is not a life-altering scenario.
It's something you'll hear sometimes from anti-trans activists about, well, any kind of alteration of a child is mutilation, therefore, right?
Well, like you said, I think in the show it's presented as a straw man argument. And I think if you're talking to a person who supports trans rights, they're not going to see fixing a cleft palate and circumcision as the same level of alteration as gender reassignment. But I think that does track. Like they're comparing in it's like apples and oranges. Like they're different enough that you can't equate them. But I think that does beg the question, where is that line? You know, and I don't know that answer. But like where is that line of like what is culturally accepted as something that you can do for a child for their own benefit, and then where is that line? And you know, culturally that's going to change depending on the culture and depending on the people, and in the Orville's case, depending on the species. But in our striving for like universal wellness, you know, like what are the basic frameworks in which we can all agree what is okay and what is not okay? Like in striving for that, I do think it's just an interesting question, I think, for me, that I do not have an answer to, but I do realize there's this big gray area of like what is and isn't okay and why, and what are our assumptions about that.
I agree, and in that I don't know what that line is, and I think it's an interesting question that we still are working on as a society, and will probably continue to evolve. What I think is important in terms of a takeaway is she, being a doctor in the show, presents her as an authority on the welfare of children, in this case, right, or of her patients, and she is, and for that reason, tracking the way Claire's attitude changes, or at least the way the show adapts her attitude in later episodes, I think is important to just sort of keep an eye on, because we tend, no matter what side of an argument you're on about a difficult issue, you usually feel supported in your position if you have some sort of authority behind you to say, well, I have a book, or I have an expert, or I have a consensus or a panel or whatever, a ruling, something to say someone else who's supposed to know this stuff has granted me the right to say that this isn't just me expressing my opinion.
I've done my own research on the internet. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
It does help to have your thoughts and your opinions grounded in something outside of yourself, and you just hope that the sources you're looking at are reputable and trustworthy. I want to go back for a second, though, talking about just like medical procedures, especially on infants, because I realized that, like this is actually still happening today. Like when intersex children are born, when they have both male and female sex organs, a lot of the times doctors will correct that, and they choose one gender over the other, and make that baby conform to what a male typically looks like or what a female typically looks like, and
the binary.
Yeah, to the binary, and there's, I'm not tapped into where that is right now as far as like the medical consensus and activism and like where that conversation is. I'm not tapped into that. But, I know someone who is intersex, and she identifies as she, and she physically was made to look like a woman, but she wasn't born that way, and that's something that she really struggles with. And I think that's a question here, that this is a very relevant question about like, if a baby's born intersex, what do you do and why,
Yeah, and so it's revealed that Clyden in a later episode, but it's relevant here because we learned that Clyden was born assigned female. He says to Bortus,
I would give anything to be ignorant of my beginnings. Topa may never be happy, but unhappiness is better than despair.
And he's referencing his own experience in wishing that he didn't know that he had been born female. He found out because when Bortus joined the Union fleet, he was examined by a non-Moclan doctor who then found evidence of the procedure.
Yeah. Clyden's feelings about whether or not to have his child undergo this procedure, as well as whether or not to tell Topa later on about what happened, are really rooted in his own biases and his own experience. And as much as we were talking about straw man arguments earlier in this episode, especially around the courtroom scene, one of the things I really like about Orville is the complexity of issues that they present. And it's not really this clear-cut, here are the good guys, here are the bad guys. Like, you can actually see the tension of all these different issues interacting. And so I personally had a lot of sympathy for Clyden when he was expressing just how awful the experience was for him personally and how much he wanted to spare Topa from that. And I can sympathize with that. I can understand that perspective of, like, this terrible thing happened to me and I don't want someone I care about to go through that. But what Clyden's also doing is assuming that his experience is not only what's going to be true in perpetuity, but it's also going to be true for everybody. Like, because this is the way I feel, that's the way I'm going to assume someone else is going to feel. Like, he doesn't have the room or the imagination to imagine a different way for someone to receive that information and to experience it. It's in a way he's projecting. He's projecting his experience onto Topa, assuming, like, this is what happened to me, therefore that's what's going to happen to you.
It's like the limits of empathy.
The limits of empathy. I like that. Yeah, yeah, and because he can't imagine something else. He can't imagine it being different for himself or for anybody else. And in that way, he's really limiting Topa and what he thinks is possible for Topa in this.
Yeah, which, I mean, that's what the procedure is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we learn in this episode that female Moclans exist, and some of them, like Havina, have had a huge cultural impact on their society, albeit, having to write under a pseudonym.
Yeah.
And the surgery itself that is forced on the infant is limiting their ability to be exceptional in any way, right? Like, yes, it's possible, it's likely, in fact, that Clyden is right, that given what we see of the Moclans, that if Topa grows up female, she's going to have a hard life amongst Moclans, especially if she would try to live with them, if that were even possible. But that, who knows what kind of life she could achieve because of that difficulty, because of that uniqueness that is a part of her. And it may be that it's more than she wants to deal with, or it may be something that she's incredibly proud of. He doesn't know, right? But he's deciding, here's the scope of what you're going to be allowed to be and who you're going to be allowed to be before you even have figured out who you are for yourself.
Thank you for bringing that up. I was thinking about, I know we're kind of like jumping back and forth between Orville and Star Trek, or at least I'm about to. But if you think about it with Geordi, he was born blind. They didn't correct that. And he has his visor, but he is able to have an experience of reality that is different from the typical human, that could have been labeled a disability, or it could be labeled as an advantage and a uniqueness. Like, he can see ranges of light that we can't, because he can't see the way we see, and like, who's to say that that's a disability versus an opportunity? And I've also been studying a little bit about indigenous healing traditions and practices. And I remember reading about a Native American healer who actually went blind, and his feeling that he went blind in order to do the work that he was meant to do in his life. Like the blindness was actually the gateway for him to go into this other part of his life. And he wouldn't have been able to be the kind of healer he was meant to be without losing his ability to see, at least see this world. And I find that beautiful, you know, and maybe I'm romanticizing it. I will totally admit that is possible, but I do think that there are so many different ways of being in the world and experiencing reality, and why should we put blinders on to some of that? And why should we say what is and isn't a way to exist?
Yeah, adversity is part of existence, no matter what cards you're dealt, to some extent. The Mocklins are saying, you know, from their cultural perspective, being a female is essentially a disability, one that they compassionately correct in their own minds, right? And they're actually, we will have to do an episode about disability in Star Trek, because it's a rich topic, and I don't want to get too far off, but there's a great scene in an episode called Loud as a Whisper from the second season of TNG, where there's a deaf character who's a diplomat, and the actor actually is deaf as well. And he and Geordi have a little conversation talking about what he calls their specialness. He doesn't refer to it as a disability, and it's touching in its 1980s kind of way.
I love your encyclopedic ability just to recall episodes like that. It is one reason I'm so glad I'm doing this podcast with you. I do not have that skill.
Well, you're you know humans and I know Star Trek, so that's how we make this work. Our next episode is from season 2, called Deflectors. It was written by David A. Goodman, directed by Seth MacFarlane, and aired in 2019. The Orville's new chief of security, a Selayan named Tala Kiali, is approached in secret by a Mocklin scientist who is aboard the ship to upgrade its defense systems, and who also happens to be an ex-lover of Bortus. He confesses to Tala that he has an attraction to females, and specifically an attraction to her, which she finds herself reciprocating. Because of the Mocklin's hypermisogyny, attraction to women is considered an unnatural and dangerous aberration, discovery of which is punishable by exile of the accused and his family. The scientist, Lokar, appears to have been murdered by Clyden, who unsurprisingly regurgitates his culture's dominant bigotries. But an investigation by Tala reveals that Clyden was framed by Lokar in order to provide him an alibi to disappear from Moklis. While she is sympathetic to his plight, has developed real feelings for him, and is disgusted by Glyden's bigotry, she is compelled by her duty to turn him into the authorities on Moklis to face judgment. So this episode is the most tangentially related to Topa specifically, but I wanted to include it for a couple of reasons. One, it further fleshes out Mocklin culture in a way that I think is important in terms of the way they see gender and gender norms. It also, in terms of talking about the evolution of the allegories that we're looking at here, in the way the Orville, I think, mirrors the way Trek has evolved in a lot of ways in talking about these issues. This is a second season episode, and it reminds me a lot of The Outcast from TNG that we talked about last week, in that, yeah, it still has many of the same problems, but it's a little bit more nuanced and sort of sophisticated in the way it's talking about gender, despite still falling into some of these issues with binary and having... So again, we're talking about a straight relationship being the metaphor for something, not for something queer. At the very least, in this case, we do at least have Clyden and Bortus and the rest of the Mocklins who are essentially gay, although being gay in a society that denies the existence of an entire gender as opposed to choosing that gender for yourself is iffy. in terms of the representation. You know, it would be nice. Here, let me put it this way: it would be nice if on the Orville there was just a human gay couple or two, and some thruples, and just something a little outside of the heteronormative binary that we are stuck with most of the time.
That's fair. And the hetero-monogamous binary, or heteronormative, well, how would you say it? Monogamous?
Monogonormative, is that the word?
I have no idea.
Monogamy-centric, maybe?
Yeah, heteronormative, monaga.
Man, if I had to live on Maklis, I'd probably kill myself.
You know, as much as they're trying to push the envelope on diversity, there's still a lot that they're leaving out. And maybe it's baby steps, you know, like you just have to push it as far as you think you can successfully do it before you like take the further step after that. So, you know, like, you know, there's a gay couple in Discovery now. So at least that's starting to be more prevalent in media, which I appreciate. But, you know, there's still a lot of people and a lot of stories that are not being told yet.
And that's the irony, is that people who, as we were talking about before, who look to the Orville as the more true heir to classic Star Trek over the actual Star Trek series that are on the air now, will bitch about the diversity casting in shows like Discovery. Yeah. And yet, you know, racking my encyclopedic brain, for even in this new series, yeah, you're right. There's one gay couple on Discovery. There's one other gay character. There's one trans character. There's one non-binary character. And then on Strange New Worlds, there's one non-binary antagonist. And on Lower Decks, there is one character who is apparently pansexual. And then I guess there's Seven of Nine and Raffi and Picard. There's like, it's like a little tiny bit, but it's not like, you know, the way people complain about it, you'd expect it to be some sort of gay pride parade running through the corridors. And it's like, no, it's still a lot of straight people. It's a lot of white people. Relax.
Yeah, there's still a lot of straight people. Like the diversity, like that's included is kind of sprinkled in. And also that the diversity is a big part of their stories. You know, like being gay or being non-binary or being pansexual, like seems to be a big part of their identity and their story. And when we can get to the point where those types of people and those identities are included, but it's not central to who they are as characters or their own development or their own story, that is what I think is real inclusion.
That really was Gene Roddenberry's vision for Star Trek in general, was to say, it's the future now. Yes, all of these people exist and they're valid and wonderful, or they're terrible. Like it's an individual thing, but we're not drawing attention to it for its own sake because it is just normal. It is just all part of the world. He tried to do that as much as he could in the 60s with his bridge crew. Your comment about Indigenous First Nations peoples reminded me of the motion picture, which we're going to talk about one day. It's my favorite Star Trek movie because I'm weird, and I don't think you've seen it yet. But there's an inclusion of a lot of Native Americans in space. It's kind of funny because they're the only people who dress with like feathers in their hair and stuff. It's not great, but the intention is there, right? Of like, okay, there are still these people in the future. In the 1970s, that was something. Mm-hmm. Getting back to the Orville, one of the things that I do, despite my frustration with the fact that there isn't more of a diverse casting, especially in terms of sexual identities and sexual orientations, is that it is a story just about people who all get along and they're friends, and they don't draw attention to those facets of themselves the way, you know, especially on Discovery and sometimes at Picard, it's like your trauma and your issue is like your whole identity sometimes, and it can be a little emotionally exhausting. But that said, you know, you look at the way that Tala in this episode is so personally outraged by the treatment that Lokar has, and the way, and Clyden's attitude. It's not about her, but she is a great example of allyship, right? In that she feels that plight for herself despite it not being her issue.
Lokar didn't hurt you. He didn't hurt anyone. All he wanted was love. And yet because of you, his life is over. For no reason except your own prejudice. So as far as I'm concerned, you can go straight to hell.
Yeah, and again, I think the conflict that Tala is faced with is another example of Orville just making an issue very gray as opposed to just being black or white. Because Lokar frames Clyden for his murder, and he has reasons for that. You know, like it was to spare his family a sense of shame, and it was also because Clyden was going to out him. And so in a way, like there's a lot of arrows pointing to Clyden as the bad guy here, you know, but Tala couldn't let him go away for a murder he didn't commit. And so as much as she sympathized with the wrongful persecution that Lokar was being subjected to, that didn't excuse what he had attempted to do. And like there's a real conflict there, and there's no easy right or wrong, good or bad for the most part. And again, that's something I really, really love that Orville does. I think they just really make you wrestle with both sides of an argument in really compelling ways, and they don't just make it very clear about like, oh, who's supposed to win in this situation, at least in a way that ignores the emotional conflict of the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I agree with you. And there is a lot of empathy to be had for Clyden. At the same time, boy, he cannot help himself. It's like he obviously is dealing with some sort of repressed trauma about his own experience of having his forced reassignment as a baby and finding out that he had been born female. And you want to talk about projection, like this guy cannot stop outing people. He is such a gossip and a busybody, and so he's got his nose in other people's business, and he feels like he has to go, report them to the police, essentially. And that's a behavior that I think we see a lot in the world, right? And in terms of the psychological underpinnings, is it fair to say that if you encounter someone who is intent on always centering themselves on their own concerns and fucking up people's lives for these crusades of theirs, is it fair to say that there's probably some trauma involved, or is that too generous?
When psychologists look at anger and cognitive bias, and especially behavior that seems to delve into this kind of dichotomous black and white thinking versus it being a rational, thought out behavior towards someone, there seems to be a vestige of evolutionary brain structure and social behavior that's being evoked in those instances. So the argument is that when humans were evolving, hundreds of thousands of years ago, there must have been a evolutionary advantage to having an us and them mentality, and that it was really, really important to belong to whatever group you belonged to. And we still have those kind of cognitive structures in our brains, and they can be activated in times of great stress, and they can be activated when you get this sense of this other person is supposed to be my enemy, and I don't really need to think about why. I just know that they are my enemy. And it can kind of switch into this, sometimes it's called a kind of primitive way of thinking. And I'm very hesitant to use that word because it's been thrown as an insult at a lot of cultures and a lot of people. And I'm not meaning that in any kind of derogatory way. I mean it in a evolutionary kind of way, you know, in that, like, it's a very animalistic way that our brains work, is the way I'm trying to use that word. And so I think Clyden is falling victim or prey to that kind of animalistic way of thinking, us versus them, I have to protect myself and my kind. There's also this sense of people can, based on the culture and the family that they grow up in, like the in-group in which they find themselves and to which there's a really, really strong desire to belong. Like, our survival as humans depended on us being part of a tribe, you know, and exile to be, you know, have to live on the savannah by yourself was essentially a death sentence like thousands of years ago. And so we have this really strong survival instinct to belong to a group. And any group has a sense of how you're supposed to behave. There's rules of conduct. And if someone violates those rules of conduct, if essentially you see someone and they are doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, especially, that can be very threatening to someone else, either because, oh, they don't belong in this group and I have to somehow punish them for violating the way I think they're supposed to be in order to belong to this group.
Your feeling of safety, security, and inclusion depends on the integrity of the group. The group has its norms and conventions and bigotry, frankly, usually. And so keeping anyone who, either keeping people within the group conforming to those norms so that it maintains its integrity and you keep your safety, or exiling them from the group so that it maintains its hegemony, either way maintains your sort of safety net without any kind of deep introspection. That's what's, I guess, primitive about it. It's psychologically primitive, right? It's it's relying on base instincts of fear and anxiety as opposed to a more evolved and considered thinking.
Yes, yeah, it's very instinctual, and we all can fall prey to this. Like, you know, have you ever gotten into an argument with your, you know, with your spouse or with your partner? And
no,
good for you.
Not once.
Not once. But, like, you know, suddenly it's this very heightened, like, right, wrong, black, white. Just like, you're not thinking rationally because there are these more base, primal, instinctive feelings and cognitive mechanisms that are being evoked. And then when you calm down, you're like, oh, I actually said things that I wish I hadn't said, you know, and you try to return to this place where you can be thoughtful and use your frontal cortex, which is the rational thinking part of your brain, which makes us human. You try to regain access to those thought processes versus just relying on these more protective, instinctual impulses.
Later in the same season, another pair of Trek veterans, writer Joe Menosky and director Jonathan Frakes, deliver the episode Sanctuary. A Moclan couple boards the Orville in an attempt to smuggle their daughter to a secret colony where, it is eventually discovered, Havina and some other 6,000 female Moclans have been hiding and smuggling female infants for years. Captain Mercer and the crew reveal the secret to the Union Council, which debates what to do with this information. The Moclan delegation threatens to leave the Union, ending not only their membership, but critical supply of weapons to the ongoing conflict with the Kaylon. An uneasy compromise is reached under which the colony is to cease its smuggling of infants and be granted no official status by the Union, but will not be otherwise impeded by the Moclan Authority. So we find Topa here again now. So the Moclans age quickly, like happens a lot with aliens in sci-fi because it's a convenient way to avoid the tedium of, well, it's a baby and I guess they can talk in 5 seasons, you know.
Yeah.
So even though Topa is like a year and a half old at most at this point, I think a year old, he's in school and talking. Obviously he reads as about 9 in human years, I would say, and what he's learning and he's reflecting. So you know, we pick up the show with him regurgitating a lot of Clyden's misogynistic and sexist attitudes about the girls in his class and the women on the ship.
Your teacher says you took it from her and that you pushed her.
Yeah, so?
That was wrong, Topa.
But she's a female. They're inferior. It doesn't matter what they think.
Where did you hear such things?
From Papa.
And despite his history having this really traditionalist Moclan view of gender.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really hard and sad to see. But it's also that regardless of how quickly children age, at least humanoid children, they are trying to make sense of the world around them. And they are going to try to make sense of the world based on what the caregivers in their lives are telling them and showing them and doing with them. So the fact, you know, like he's just picking up all this stuff from Clyden and he doesn't know any better. Like kids don't know any better. And so he's just saying this because that's how the world is. Like that's the exposure he's been given. And it's really sad to see, also knowing that like, oh, like you were born female and you don't know that. And yet you're internalizing these biases from Clyden just because he internalized them as well, and now he's passing them on to you as some kind of like psychic emotional inheritance. And it's heavy. It's so hard to watch. It's really hard to watch.
Well, and I think most of us can relate to that aspect of the story for sure, where how it's cliched, but how many of us look in the mirror one day and say, oh my God, I'm my father or I'm my mother. And we're recreating and reinventing the traumas that we were exposed to as children. And I don't think we ever really escape it fully, but we can at least, well, and it's a good segue because Bortus notices his behavior. He, on some level, has accepted that Clyden is the way he is. Not fully, as we'll see, but on some level, he's like, well, Clyden's an adult. He's a typical Moclan in terms of his attitudes. It is what it is. We coexist and we're married. But with his child, I think he realizes that there's this potential for the next generation to be a little bit better. Mm-hmm. And so when he sees Topa behaving this way, he's inspired to take some sort of action to correct that behavior and to show Topa a better way of being in the world and better way of interacting with women and girls. And that's why he makes the risky choice to expose Topa to the infant baby that's being smuggled.
It is a female.
Her name is Mercer.
But there are no Moclan females.
Only a few are born every generation. Some people fear them. That is why her parents have chosen to conceal her. Look at her, Topa. She is not so different from you or I.
Even though relying on a child to keep a secret like that is kind of stupid, right? It's not a good idea, and obviously it blows up in his face because Topa tells Clyden, and that's what leads us down this again. Clyden making everyone's life suck.
Yeah, I think this episode and also in Midnight Blue, which we'll talk about later in this episode, those are both examples of adults trusting children with an adult level of responsibility. And they're both examples of how badly that can go and go wrong. And like I see that as, I understand Bortus's intention of just trying to show Topa, here's a female baby. and this is really important, and you can't tell anybody about this. Like, I understand his motivation there, but that's also such a big responsibility to give a child when they can't really understand the weight of what would happen if they did tell.
I don't want to be too hard on Bortus here because, you know, the risk and reward is a theme in the episode. You see it with Havina too. You know, they take the risk of exposing the colony to the Union because they have to, because the alternative is for them to either try to keep the Orville crew there against their will, which would invite other people to investigate and blow up in their faces, or for the entire Orville crew to try to keep the secret, which wouldn't work, even though it's not a bunch of children, right? It's a bunch of adults, but they still wouldn't be able to keep that secret. It just wouldn't happen. So the risk is you expose yourself, and the reward is potentially you get everything you want from the risk, or you lose everything. And in both cases, with Bortus's decision with Topa and with the colony's decision regarding the Union, they get a partial victory, a moral victory, you might say, in that, the secrets were exposed, and the smuggling is put to an end for now. But we see that the colony, at the very least, they are known and they have some degree of autonomy, and they get to, at least the women that are already there get to live in relative freedom compared to what they were dealing with before. They have begun the revolution, the Dolly Parton revolution.
Tumble out of bed and stumble to the kitchen.
On some level, right? That's often how revolutions start. They're not just instant successes. You have a lot of growing pains. And then Topa exhibits better behavior in the end, where he isn't quite the asshole that his father would have him be. And so it makes it worth it on some level, right?
I thought that last scene when Bortus goes into the school to see Topa, and Topa's now playing with the same girl that he shoved earlier. Like, I thought that was like, that is also a victory. You know, it starts with people, and how do people change, and how do they change the way that they treat each other. Like, that is part of the same revolution, and I think it's a small victory, but I also think a really momentous one.
Hey, Treknobabblers, we hope you're enjoying the show. We wanted to take a moment to invite you to follow us on social media.
Yeah, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Treknopsychopod. You can also find us on Facebook at Treknobabble Psychobabble Podcast. And if you have any questions or comments or ideas that you would love for us to cover in our podcast, you can email us at treknopsychopod@gmail.com.
And we would love for you to also follow us on YouTube at Treknopsychopod, where you can enjoy our podcasts with all of the stunning visuals that are included. And if you would like to support us on Patreon at Treknobabble Psychobabble Podcast, we would appreciate any support you can offer. Enjoy the show. Speaking of Dolly Parton, I think this is a good place to talk about music in the Orville, because to me it's quite special. You and I are both musicians. We haven't talked about this yet on the pod, but that's how we met. That's what we still do with a lot of our time. Well, there's a few different aspects to the music in the Orville, but most of it is just absolutely fantastic. And the orchestral scores remind me a lot of the original series, which is one of the best attributes of that show. And it's just, sometimes it's too much, and I don't care, because it's interesting in and of itself. And when the jokes aren't landing, which the jokes don't always land on the Orville, at least the score is really good. And then you've also got a lot of these really well-chosen popular pieces, songs, right? In this case, 9 to 5 is the running theme. So she's exposed to Dolly Parton, and it becomes the voice of the revolution, right? And there's something so weird about watching this kind of Star Wars-y FX space battle and then these kind of somewhat brutal ground fight with 9 to 5 playing on the track. You know, it's goofy, but it's effective, and it's a very Orville thing, right?
Yeah, I do appreciate the music in the Orville, also for both the popular music, like the almost absurdity of having Dolly Parton playing during this like battle scene, but also like Seth MacFarlane uses absurdity as a tool in a really, really effective way. And so I appreciated that. It's like science fiction doesn't need to be serious, like and life is also absurd. So why don't we have art reflect the absurdity that life can also have sometimes? Like that's my 2 cents. The orchestral backdrops of that series are just so sweeping, and they remind me of like old Hollywood movies in just a really like the music is a character. It's not just this background thing. And I really, really appreciate the presence that music has in this show. And I hope we get to talk about music in depth in one of our other episodes.
Yeah, we will definitely do at least one music episode. We'll do several music episodes. But Trek in the 90s, there's a whole story behind this, which we're not going to get into now, but there's a reason why the background music, at least in Star Trek in middle TNG and on, started to get really boring and bland. There's a reason for it, and the reason's Rick Berman, but he's usually the answer to why did something bad happen. But we'll get to it someday.
Keep listening to our podcast to find out.
There it is. What I want to say is that the way the music plays a role in the story, I think, and what you said, Elizabeth, about the playing with absurdity and using it as a tool, I think reflects the way the series is improving from the first season going into the third season, in that the show was pitched as this parody of The Next Generation, essentially, almost like Galaxy Quest. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but it's got this like, oh, it's just making fun and it's stupid Seth MacFarlane jokes, and it's I want to do that. And the show, little by little, attenuates those comedic and goofy elements to kind of take you off your guard about the serious topics in the show, so that by the time you find yourself actually invested in the story, you are surprised at how much you are drawn into the metaphor and the political allegory and the emotional lives of these goofy characters. And it's entirely the opposite approach of the first generation new Star Trek series, Discovery and Picard, which are so serious, and every emotional thing is just, and the world's about to explode and all the time, and it's like exhausting. And it actually has the opposite effect of drawing you in, because you are just sucked in, right, to that story, and you're either okay with it or you're not. And I think that approach that the Orville has had, whether intentional or not, is very much to its credit in terms of giving space for these sci-fi allegories, which find their way to pretty good messages in the end.
Yeah. I think that's a really excellent point. And, I think in the way that Orville and Star Trek are starting to influence each other, I think Strange New Worlds definitely has a lot more humor than Picard and Discovery.
Yeah.
And like I have guffawed in a couple episodes of New Worlds, which I have loved. I've really, really loved that series, and I can't wait for season 2. And also, like, some of the best comedians, they are using humor to actually get a very serious point across. So,
yes,
it's all tools, and it's all rhetoric, and it's all about what are you trying to say and how can you say it. And sometimes you sneak people into the room and you're making them laugh along the way, and then you arrive and you're like, here's where we were going. And I'm like, that takes skill. Bravo.
Well, to that point, there's this excellent line in Havina's speech when she is speaking before the Union Council at the end of the episode, before she goes into Dolly Parton.
The history of moral progress can be measured by the expansion of fundamental rights to those who have been denied them. We ask only to be included in that expanding circle of justice.
And this is where I think we're seeing the evolution of the show and it taking stock of what it has in these characters and what it's saying and to whom it's saying these things. And that when you take that attitude where you're always looking to provide moral progress, 9 times out of 10, you're going to find yourself on the right side of history. After hiatus and restructuring of the show, the Orville returned to television in 2022, rebranded with the subtitle New Horizons. Series creator Seth MacFarlane wrote and directed our next episode from this season called A Tale of Two Topas. A now adolescent Topa finds himself depressed and searching for the answer to a question he doesn't know to ask. He shadows Commander Grayson in hopes of one day applying to become a Union officer. She notes his inquisitive demeanor to his parents, and fitting with his attitudes, Clyden forbids Topa to continue shadowing her. After this, Topa expresses suicidal ideation to Isaac, who recently attempted to deactivate himself. When Kelly learns this, she provides a covert means for Topa to discover the truth about his origins. After a time sitting with the truth, Topa asks Dr. Finn to reverse the correcting reassignment surgery. Clyden is outraged, of course, and in denial. Kelly is uncertain about overstepping. Bortus is at a loss on how to help his child. Claire wants to perform the surgery, and Ed is concerned about the Moclan alliance. They take their concerns to the Union Council, which reluctantly orders Claire not to perform the surgery. Isaac devises a workaround this restriction by having him, a non-commissioned officer, perform the surgery instead, and in plausible deniability of the rest of the crew. Although the Admiralty is seething and the Moclan government is enraged, their workaround successfully maintains peace with Moclus while allowing Topa to get her surgery. Clyden says some ugly things to his daughter and his mate before leaving the Orville, apparently forever. Despite this, Topa finds herself happy for the first time in her life.
I was blown away by this episode, and I also had to do a double take when it ended. I was like, that was basically a movie, and I'm so appreciating this age of television where we get these wonderful movies.
Yeah, I cried a few times, and I think this is probably the best episode so far, if it gets renewed, of the Orville.
Oh, please be renewed! Please be renewed!
I know. I want it to keep going too. There's a lot to talk about here. In terms of the show coming to grips with this unintentional allegory that they have with Topa, right? So we talked about how in About a Girl, they were trying to address sexism on some level and ended up creating this potentially really harmful story about bioessentialism and erasing trans identity unintentionally. But that was something you could easily take away from that episode if it in some way mapped with your views. And here, they're quite literally taking the best parts of that story, because there's a scene where Kelly takes Topa into the, not the holodeck, the simulator, and replays the recording of her speech to the Moclan judge thing when they were deciding Topa's fate about her original reassignment surgery.
I read about her in the Kimbok file, but it did not describe her appearance. Her face appears so wise.
Wait till you hear her speak.
When I was born, long ago, my parents made the choice to allow me to remain female. They taught me to think, to read, to wonder. They taught me to love the person I was. When they passed, I remained. I had planned to die up there, undiscovered. But that is no longer possible. The tribunal must not be allowed to take from this child the gift that I was given. So I present myself to you as a woman without regret. I am happy.
And that's literally what they're doing in terms of, taking this clip from the show, but also taking these elements from the story and reworking them just enough where they can correct the bad message that was unintentionally put out. And here they are unambiguous. Still gray, there's still a lot of moral ambiguity happening here, but they're not ambiguous about what Topa represents. And she is telling people, this is who I am. My body doesn't match my identity. Please help me. Mm-hmm. And people are responding the way they do. And I think that's so skillful, just in terms of taking, in Star Trek, frankly, a lot of times when they had shitty episodes, they just ignored them and moved on. And that's there's value to that too. Don't get me wrong. I don't think we need to revisit Code of Honor, for example.
According to our customs, it's called an act of war. This is not an act of war, but of love.
I challenge your right of supersedence.
No woman has challenged supersedence for over 200 years.
The right is mine, and I will have it. Natasha Yar, I challenge you. A struggle to the death.
Try to fix it. But I really am impressed by what they did here.
I was really impressed with that too. And I so appreciated having that scene from season 1. They just took it, they just completely redid the footage and very elegantly added Topa and Commander Grayson back in. And I was also really struck by just the differences in hair and makeup between season 1 of Kelly and season 3. Like in season 1, she was so dolled up, and in season 3, like, she's just a normal person now. She's always been a normal person, but like she's not being presented as like, look how attractive I am. She's like, I'm doing my job. And I also really
it reflects so much more maturity
in
the creating. Yeah,
and I also really appreciate just seeing that evolution in just in a core character, just like she's still female, she's still the same person, but they're just being a lot more in my opinion relaxed about the way they're presenting her, and they're trying less, I think, to make her into something she's not.
And another thing in this season, Ed, who's played by Seth MacFarlane, right, has much less to do than in the earlier seasons. It's his show, and it's sort of his. A lot of times, earlier episodes of the Orville can read like, well, I have all this money and I get to play and be in Star Trek, and that's good for you, buddy, but that doesn't necessarily make for the best TV. And now he's having, again, the maturity, or whoever is having the maturity to tell Seth, or for him to tell himself, you have a role to play, but you need to let other people shine the way they shine, because Adrian Palicki is a way better actor than Seth MacFarlane. And so he gives her, or the writers give her, more meaty material to play than Seth now, and that's to the show's credit. And the fewer things that Ed/Seth are doing on screen in this season really count more. And I think, his depiction in this episode, where he's playing the role of mediating all these different moving parts and really stepping into his own as a leader, I think is really wonderful. The best Ed episode, in my opinion.
I can definitely see that. And I do agree with you that the Orville could have been seen as a vanity project when it first started. And I personally would have loved to have the means to like create and star in my own Star Trek universe. If I could do that, I would have. I'm not going to say that I would be above that. But I do love the way the show has changed and matured and evolved, and that especially now, especially in the 3rd season, it's not just Ed Mercer being the star of every single episode. Like, he really has taken a step back, and we're seeing a lot of different characters coming to the forefront, and their stories being told and their characters being developed, which I think is really wonderful. We've talked about how Strange New Worlds is like that. It's not like Captain Pike all the time. Whereas in Discovery, it's Michael Burnham all the time.
All the time.
And I like Discovery. I really, really do. And I know we have different opinions about that. But I've really grown to appreciate the way that Strange New Worlds just kind of turns in their ensemble cast. And it really, really is an ensemble. And you get to see all these different characters and meet all these different actors. And I get a much broader sense of just the community and who all these people are versus it being about one person and them kind of being at the front and center of everything. So I very much appreciate that Orville is starting to take that perspective as well.
Yeah, it's just generally more mature, sophisticated storytelling.
Yeah.
And that's excellent. A couple of things to note here in terms of, now they have this trans character, and we need to be very clear about the change that happens with Dr. Finn. So Claire, in About a Girl, the first season episode, refuses, as we talked about, refuses to perform surgery on a non-consenting infant.
I will not perform a sex change on a perfectly healthy newborn. You ever hear of the Hippocratic Oath?
It is my understanding that as a doctor, your duty is to cure illness.
Mortis, this is not an illness. Your child was born female. I got news for you. It happens all the time.
Which has its moral place. I mean, we get that. But now we're in a place where Topa can consent. She's still a minor, so she isn't just allowed to do this on her own. She needs a parent, a guardian to consent to that. Although it's interesting that it's just one instead of both of them. But what's so lovely here is what Claire says, where she's like,
the most important thing we can do right now is listen. Topa's gonna have to guide us.
And that's, I think, such a healthy attitude to take, because people get really sensitive and moralizing when it comes to trans kids, right? Because they think on some level, like Clyden, that they're protecting these kids from themselves or from society having their influence or whatever it might be that they think justifies their prejudices. And so when leaving that aside, when it's not about my moral argument or my political agenda versus you, other adult, your political agenda, listen to the child, see what they have to say, and then from your caregiving perspective, consent to changes that they need to make. And I want to be really, really clear here that underage children do not have gender confirming surgery anywhere. That doesn't happen. They take puberty blockers sometimes, which have their effects are reversible should a child decide that they don't want to transition anymore at some point. That's a thing that happens. But in terms of actual surgery, it happens when you're an adult, not before. And so stop freaking out about it, please.
It's another straw man argument, like if we can make you outraged about something that isn't true, but makes you take the side of the issue we want to do, like isn't that smart of us?
Speaking of good caregiving and good parenting, Bortus in this episode, oh my God! So he's in this incredibly awkward position where he has his mate, his partner, is still being the worst. And when I say the worst, I mean at the end of the episode, literally tells their child,
I wish you were never born.
I can't imagine something uglier than that. And yet Bortus, in his pain, says something so incredibly wonderful to Topa when he says,
listen very closely to me. You are perfect.
Yeah, I thought that scene where Clyden leaves, I thought was so heartbreaking on so many levels. I think throughout this whole story arc, you really get to see the relationship between Bortus and Clyden be tested. And a big part of that, I think, is the relationship that each of them has to their child, and like how their relationship to Topa is affecting the relationship that they have with each other. And I think that's true with a lot of parents, not being a parent myself, but when you have a child, it really changes things. And I did wonder, like, how much of this would have come to a head if they had never had a child? How much did their relationship with Topa force that these fractures to like become more stressed and to become more apparent in their own relationship. And I also, I thought it was so beautiful when Bortus countered what Clyden said. Topa could have been replaying in her head over and over and over for years, and Bortus just stepped in and was like, no, I am gonna nix this right now. And alongside, maybe didn't completely erase the damage that statement that Clyden said did, but also just offered at the same time, you are perfect. And I think I just thought that was so healing and just so much. So he was so well attuned to like what was best for his child in that moment. And it wasn't about getting angry at Clyden or yelling at Clyden or telling Topa what an awful person Clyden was. It was, Topa, you are perfect.
And leaning into the love that he had in the face of the pain that they were both experiencing. I think that was the lesson for me, was you can either revel in the hurt, or you can find the joy that's still under the surface, right?
Yeah. It's yes and.
One very important thing, and it's subtle. The episode doesn't draw a lot of attention to it, but it's so important and beautifully done, is the cast, the people in Topa's life besides Clyden, as soon as Topa tells them that she is female, in her words, they immediately switch to using she, her, hers pronouns, even before she gets her surgery, which is an essential thing in terms of modeling behavior that, again, people get so caught up in themselves when it comes to pronouns sometimes, on both sides. But the point is, she said who she is. They don't stumble over it. They don't make a big thing of it. They just do it and acknowledge it, and except for the asshole, except for the bad guy who doesn't.
There's so many moments in this episode that I think are kind of like guideposts for people navigating this terrain, both as how do you manage someone's preferred pronouns, and with what kind of grace do you do that? And then also with Bortus, like so many parenting moments, both when he was, in the scene where Clyden leaves, and then earlier when he's talking with Commander Grayson, and he just is sobbing about like, I don't know how to help my child. And so many parents, I think, especially, so many parents, period, but especially of trans kids, can be so lost, I think, about like, how do I help you? I don't know what to do. This is all new to me and I don't understand it, and I'm learning along with you. And I think that can so easily feel like you're failing and you don't know what to do. And I think the show just really is very accepting of like, this is hard and we're going to figure it out and we need to listen.
And what a wonderful correction for, Bortus, he's kind of the Orville's, the Mocklins are kind of the Orville's version of the Klingons, right? But we talked about how they are written to be this kind of exaggeration, caricature of toxic masculinity. And so for him to be the one who's like, I'm a single parent, I don't know what to do, and Kelly's there to comfort him. And also the community of the Orville is there to help him to raise his child. He's not alone, despite the fact that he doesn't have the support of his partner anymore. That's, you talk about guideposts and lessons to take from, neither of us are parents, but when I think about one day maybe being one, and I'm terrified of what that could entail, it is comforting to think about having people in my life besides my husband, like just a community of people who are going to be there on some level for my child. And that's something I hope any parents who might be listening who have kids who are questioning their sexual orientation, their identity, anything else like that, try to remember that they feel alone, you feel alone, and neither of you has to be.
Yeah, I think about that with the last scene in the show when they invite Topa up to be like the acting captain, and she gets to say engage quantum drive, which I think that's such a sweet gesture for the crew to have like offered that to Topa, and I think really, really sweet, and is a symbol of the village and of this all the support that they have for her. And I also think about that scene as it relates to the way the episode opened. Like the beeline for this episode is the Orville are being archaeologists, and they're investigating a pyramid-like structure that has some hidden treasure in it. And, we've talked about how much we enjoy it when different levels of an episode are all telling the same story. And so when I was rewatching this episode, preparing for this podcast, for our episode today, I was thinking about like, how does this like hidden treasure story relate to Topa at all? And I was sitting with it and I was thinking, okay, so they've come across this structure which has this hidden treasure which they have to find. And I was thinking about that, like, what if the hidden treasure is a metaphor for the knowledge that Topa is inside female? Like that's hidden knowledge, hidden treasure. It's valuable, it's important, it's beautiful, but you have to get to it because it's been hidden and locked away, hopefully to keep it safe. And then in the episode, like all the booby traps that species put in place to protect the treasure, it would kill anybody who tried to open the door. Mm-hmm. In the show, they just send Isaac, and there's this hilarious scene where he's just like pummeled with arrows, and one finally pierces him, which is funny. But I think there's also this idea of, in order to access this treasure, part of you has to die. There has to be some kind of sacrifice. There has to be a letting go of your old life in order to access this kind of treasure, which is what Topa goes through. Like they have to give up one version of themselves and one version of their life in order to access this treasure and this beauty. And I thought that was really poetic and really sweet and kind of a nice way to understand this journey of rediscovering her true identity and her truth, and embracing that, and finally having access to this thing that was hidden but is ultimately beautiful and worthwhile despite what it took to get there. And then at the very end of the episode, like it ends with her saying engage quantum drive, which I kind of take as a way of saying, look at what else is possible now.
So on a meta-textual level, I agree with you. But there's this... So in the opening of the episode, Topa's trying to figure out who they are, what's missing, what's not happening, and is considering joining the Union, fleet, not Starfleet, the Union fleet. And their conception of it manifests in this kind of space battle simulation that they're doing in the simulator and keep losing, and it's kind of the Orville's version of the Kobayashi Maru. And then through this process of self-discovery and realizing that the thing missing in Topa's life was understanding who she really was, and in terms of her gender identity, then at the end, when we are seeing what union service really is, it's like what Kelly says, it's a lot of little things. It's kind of checking up on people, making sure they have what they need, their power allocations. The day-to-day kind of community that being an officer, 99% of it is that. And the other piece of it that's really big and really a hallmark of the affection this show has for that golden age of Star Trek that I do think is in modern Trek, but is maybe not as present as it could be, is that, there's the space battles and the laser pew, 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 but we just like digging around in the archaeology and discovering new worlds and discovering ourselves, discovering the big, beautiful universe and everything it has to offer. And I think putting Topa in the captain's chair at the end and giving her that line is the metaphor for, yes, for her own identity and self-discovery, but also figuring out what this Star Trek thing really is about on the inside.
Engage quantum drive.
Topa's story ends, for the time being at least, with Midnight Blue, written by Brandon Braga and Andre Bormanis, and directed by John Cassar. A year having passed since Sanctuary, Bordas and Kelly are sent to observe the female colony along with a Moclan security force in order to ensure the agreement is being adhered to. Since Topa has never had the chance to meet another female Moclan, she's invited to go with them. The trio spend some time on the colony, and Havina and Topa become acquainted. Havina reveals to the girl that they have resumed their smuggling operation and asks her to help curry messages covertly. The Moclan security contingent, upon learning this, kidnap Topa and subject her to abuse, ridicule, and eventually torture in the search of information about the smuggling operation. With their shuttle's communication system sabotaged, Kelly and Bordas decide to mount a rescue on their own. Upon learning of what has happened, Ed chastises Havina for manipulating Topa, but she remains adamant that the cause outweighs the life of any one individual. If Havina would admit to her coercion, they could pressure the Moclan government to reveal where she's being held. An intervention by a holographic Dolly Parton manages to convince Havina to play her cards and admit her actions to the Union Council. The Moclans pounce and double down on their position as victims of cultural relativism. Although the Union largely seems to disapprove the Moclan position, they remain unwilling to risk their military alliance, especially with the added wrinkle of having lost their alliance with the Krill. However, Bordas and Kelly are able to find and rescue Topa, taking her directly to the Union floor and revealing the way the Moclans have treated the child. This is enough to convince the Union to condemn and expel Moclus. In the end, Clyden returns to his family, realizing that his love for his daughter is stronger than his learned bigotry. They are joined by Kelly, who is now part of their found family at the dinner table.
This was a really hard episode to watch for me on multiple levels. Both, I really understood why Havina asked Topa to be the intermediate and part of the smuggling operation. Like I can sympathize with that strategic advantage of having the Union ship, of just like, we're trying to save lives here and whatever it takes. Like, I get that. And at the same time, Topa is a child and her idol is asking her to do something. And of course she's going to say yes. And like, it's just, like we mentioned earlier, it's adults put children in compromising positions all the time, but that doesn't mean they should.
Yeah. It reminded me a little bit, in a way, of what we talked about regarding Quark's relationship with Ishka from Prophet and Lace, where people who are both caregivers or parents and political activists, a lot of times their activism ends up interfering in their duties as caregivers. And Havina's not Topa's parent, but she's failing in her surrogate role as a role model and caregiver in that moment by putting the political agenda ahead of Topa's well-being. At the same time, again, she started a revolution, so you can understand why she's so adamant and passionate about taking any risks, even ones that aren't hers to take, to continue to see this. But I agree with you, this is a hard episode to watch for a lot of reasons. Very dark in places.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even gotten to the torture yet, and it's still hard to watch.
Oh, yeah, child torture.
I know.
That's to do that successfully, and this is a very successful episode in my opinion. To have something like child torture in an episode and have it not feel gratuitous is an incredible accomplishment. Yeah. On a lighter note, I don't know if you noticed this, but so we've got Dolly Parton has become this figure in the female Moclan's subculture.
Yeah.
And they obviously she's listening to recordings of Dolly, and Dolly makes it, the actual Dolly Parton appears in the episode in holographic form. But my favorite inclusion of the Parton verse was in the scene in the colony when they're all dancing in the festival. They're playing Jolene, but it's like on recorders and tambourines, like it's some medieval dance, but it's Jolene. It's so
missed
cute.
that. That's great. Oh.
Yeah, just really classy.
Yeah.
I loved it. I also appreciated that the conversation that holographic Dolly has with Havina is, it's subtle and pretty graceful in that she tells a little story and she sings a song, but she's not, you remember in About a Girl when Bortus and Clyden are both on the same page at first about giving Topa the surgery to begin with, and the other cast people, the other crewmates, each try their own way of convincing Bortus that he's wrong. So Alara fights him, right, and shows I'm strong, Selayan person, and then there's the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer thing, which is funny. It's cute, but it's so like bang on the head. They're like, here's the message, you're wrong, and Bortus immediately has the switch. And what a change in terms of the maturity of the storytelling, where you have Hollow Dolly could have just said, you need to do this, the way Ed did, right, in the earlier scene where he says, you can't abuse this child this way, because this is essentially what's happened. And instead, Dolly just says, well, here's a story about my childhood. Here's a song that you admire. We're not all perfect. All we can do is make the best choices we can in the moment, and the rest will work itself out.
I fail to grasp the meaning of this parable.
Oh, it don't mean nothing. It's just a story. I'll tell you one thing, though. My mama knew something needed to be done right then and there. If you do the right thing in the here and now, the future has a way of taking care of itself.
And that's what gets through to her. I just thought that was really sweet.
Yeah, it was really sweet and subtle and really effective, and I'm glad that it did work out in the end. Thankfully the Planetary Union did decide to protect the colony. And so what Havina was worried about everyone being compromised, and like thousands of people dying versus just Topa. And I still feel uneasy about it. I don't know. There's still something unresolved, I think, for me, in what could have happened. And I'm not sure what's there, but I also understand it's a television show.
It's a television show, and it is, I agree with you. There's a tension there because the storytelling has matured. We are having more realistic expectations about the consequences of this universe and the characters in it. At the same time, this is still a show that is emulating Star Trek. And one of the things that Star Trek has always had is a profound optimism, especially about the ability to affect political change and like sociological change, because it is presenting an idealized future, but an idealized future that has a history. It's not just that things changed somehow and we're better. Look how much better we are. People, I think, sometimes confuse that when they talk about Star Trek or properties like the Orville, where they think it's just unrealistic without any kind of underpinning philosophy. And the optimism is purchased by an actual sort of set of circumstances and procedures that you're supposed to go through to get to that point. In Star Trek, and in the Orville in a lot of ways, it's about the abolition of money and the abolition of religion, other topics for other shows. But there's like a sequence of events that led to a change in society that allowed these more optimistic outcomes to happen more often in the universe.
A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want, the need for possessions. We've grown out of our infancy.
And in the Orville's case, I feel so Star Trek-y in that scene, despite the fact that, one child's abuse, you can look at any number of conflicts going on right now in Yemen and the Ukraine, and there are lots of suffering, dead, starving children, and images of them, the reality of their existence doesn't seem to change anyone's political agenda. So it's not quite realistic to our own world. but I still like to see it.
Yeah. I was thinking about that very issue when the Union Council was debating what to do with Mocklus over the disappearance of one child. Like, I'm watching that scene and thinking, comparing it to the UN or something like that. It's like, it was so unrealistic to me that such a large planetary governing body would concern themselves over the disappearance of a single child. Like, part of me was like, this is unrealistic. And at the same time, part of me really wanted that to be so important to so many people that they actually would have. Like that, I would love to live in a universe where the well-being of a single child is enough to gather the representatives of countless countries and cultures and planets and them try to make things better and figure out what's going on. So like, I definitely had that discrepancy of this is unrealistic and I wish it was true. Yeah. And to the topic at hand, the fact that all of these different planets, except for Mocklus, they are universal, despite they're trepidatious about what to do with Mocklus because of the issue with the weapons manufacturer and the war with the Kaelon and all of that. But in terms of where they stand ethically, unambiguously in support of this trans girl. Yeah, I thought that was really beautiful too. Just again, like the complex conflict about how do you do the, it's almost like what Havina, it's the same issue Havina is wrestling with. How do you do the most good for the most people? And that's really what they're trying to figure out, because they do have this Kaelon threat. And the Mocklans have been holding their strategic importance over their head for so long, and no one's happy about it. How satisfying was that scene when Gordon stood up and yelled?
Every time they cross a line, we let it go because we're scared to fight the Kaelon without them. And every time we compromise, they still act like they're the ones getting the shaft. You treat people like garbage. And then when you get called on it, you bitch and you moan that we're not respecting your beliefs. Well, screw you and your... Jordan!
It's the same thing we were just talking about, where realistically, you're kind of with Ed, where he's like, shut up. Yeah. Shut up. Like, you're not helping. This is like politically so bad. At the same time, you're like, yes, say it.
Someone
like,
yell at them.
Fuck these people. Yes. Like, making themselves into the victim. It's so ugly when people do that. You have a clearly marginalized group, and the people doing the oppressing co-opt the status of victim in order to confuse the issue and strawman the arguments. It's so frustrating. Yeah, and I'm really glad that at least one person could kind of call them on the BS before the UN, or the planetary... Space UN. Yeah, like, before they did finally say, like, enough is enough. Like, we're not going to let you bully us anymore. So, we mentioned that there's a lot of dark in this episode, along with the light, and probably the darkest scenes are the ones involving the torture of Topa by this one-eyed Black Ops person, Mocklin. And that's followed up by this, I think, very cathartic scene in a lot of ways, but I do have some questions about it, where Bortus blinds, he and Kelly rescue Topa, and then he asks who did this to my daughter, and sees who it is, and can't contain his rage, and they get into a fight, and then eventually he takes the torture device, stabs him in the other eye, and blinds him, and it's really horrific. And despite how graphic and crazy, I mean, Star Trek Picard had a scene where Icheb had his eyeball removed, and I hate that episode. I'm going to be honest right now about that, to anyone Star Trek Picard fans. And that horrible scene had absolutely they did not inform the characters of the story at all. Mm-hmm. Here is a similarly horrible scene and graphic scene, and yet it feels cathartic because of where the characters are and what they're going through. My question, Elizabeth, is it sound to play out that kind of vengeance for Bortus? Is it healthy? I want to say no, and I'm conflicted about it, and here's why.
I can completely understand the rage that Bortus feels. You know, like, someone has hurt my child, and, like, I can only imagine the rage a parent feels when they see someone who's hurt their child and they want some punishment, some retribution, somehow to take out the anger and the betrayal and the hurt and the fear that they feel at being so helpless at seeing someone they love hurt. And I also think about everything that Bortus has gone through. Everything he's gone through with Clyden, with being Mocklin, with, like, the whole story. I can kind of see just everything coming to a head, and this being such an opportunity for Bortus just to physically let out all the stress and rage and despair and just everything he's gone through. Like, I can really understand why that all boiled up. But I am also of the mind that violence towards another human being is not okay. Or violence toward another living creature, including Mocklins, is not okay. That's a very fine line between anger. Like, you can be angry. Like, no one is saying, like, anger is an emotion that you should avoid. Or not. Like, you can express healthy anger. But when and how does it tip into violence? And how do you direct and channel that anger in a way that's not harmful to yourself or someone else? And so I guess in a way, like, we don't yet live in a perfect world where everyone does the best by themselves or by each other. And I think we're all really working toward that, but there needs to be some acceptance and grace for when we fall short. And I think this is a moment where Bortus fell short, where I can completely understand his motivations and everything that was coming up for him. But ultimately, I don't condone violence against anybody.
So as we said last week, Star Trek has gone through its own evolution, transition from having some awful and problematic things to say about the trans condition in its allegorical forms to having some pretty great representation and pretty thoughtful takes on the subject. And I hope that our dive into the Orville this week has been illuminating, because the Orville, to me, especially on this topic, represents a condensed microcosm of that evolution, and in that way reflects the worst and the best of what Star Trek is as a franchise.
Yeah, Elliott, I really just want to thank you for bringing these episodes together. I think these 3 episodes where we've been looking at trans allegories and gender and the evolution of how those issues have been portrayed in Star Trek and Star Trek-like, homages, has been really challenging and illuminating, and I really appreciate exploring all this with you.
And reminder, seek out trans creators, seek out trans Trek fans, all colors of the rainbow. We do our best, and we try to represent as much of truth and reality as we can, but we're not perfect. Next week, we have a really fun topic to explore. We're talking about imagination as reality. Elizabeth, thank you for your insightful comments as always, and your time, and thank you to our patrons and listeners, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Thank you, Elliott.